The quiet suburb of Willow Creek was a place where life moved at a leisurely pace, where neighbors exchanged smiles over white picket fences, and the loudest sounds were often the chirping of birds or the occasional bark of a dog. The streets, lined with towering oaks, were home to families who had lived there for generations. At the end of Cedar Lane stood an old house, its faded paint and creaking shutters telling stories of time's passage. This house belonged to Rebecca Hargrove, a 98-year-old widow who had lived there for nearly 6 decades. Rebecca was a beloved figure in the neighborhood, known for her warmth and generosity. Despite her age and frailty, she remained fiercely independent, insisting on tending to her modest garden filled with roses and daisies. Every morning, she could be seen shuffling out in her floral apron, humming soft tunes as she watered her plants. Children often stopped by to listen to her stories about the past or to enjoy her freshly baked cookies. Yet, despite her kindness, her home's isolated location made her vulnerable, though few would have ever imagined the danger lurking nearby. Adrian, a 16-year-old boy with an enigmatic aura, lived a few streets away. He was the kind of teenager who easily blended into the background, his presence neither welcomed nor questioned. Adrian wasn't the type to participate in school activities or neighborhood gatherings. He spent most of his time alone, glued to his computer screen, exploring corners of the internet that most would shy away from. He was drawn to the macabre, devouring content that delved into crime, death, and the darker sides of human nature. His fascination began innocently enough, sparked by documentaries and mystery novels, but over time, it deepened into something far more sinister. Adrian didn't just want to read or watch. He wanted to understand the emotions behind such acts, the motivations, and the aftermath. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, his thoughts became darker, more invasive. The idea of witnessing, or even creating such moments began to consume him. Rebecca had always been kind to Adrian, often waving at him from her garden or offering him cookies when he passed by. To Adrian, however, she was not a person, but an idea, a symbol of vulnerability, an easy target for the dark fantasies he was nurturing. He began watching her from a distance, studying her habits, her movements, her routines. Every detail became a piece of the puzzle in the plan he was silently constructing. On the night of the crime, the weather seemed to echo the tension in Adrian's mind. A storm had rolled in, and rain lashed against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. Adrian stood outside Rebecca's house, his heart pounding in his chest, though not from fear. His hands trembled as he held a small camcorder, its red recording light blinking like a heartbeat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, planning for, obsessing over. The house looked even older in the dim light, its shadows stretching across the yard like dark tendrils. Adrian hesitated for a moment, the enormity of what he was about to do dawning on him. But his curiosity and desire to feel the power he had only read about pushed him forward. He knocked lightly on the door, his face carefully arranged into a mask of innocence. Rebecca, who had been preparing for bed, was surprised by the knock. It was unusual for anyone to visit her so late, especially in such weather. Adjusting her shawl, she shuffled to the door and peered through the peephole. Adrian's young, familiar face put her at ease. Opening the door, she asked, "What brings you here at this hour, dear?" Adrian had rehearsed his response. He explained that he had been out for a walk and lost his way in the storm. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, as he asked if he could come in to make a call. Rebecca hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside to let him in. She had always believed in the goodness of people, a belief that, tonight, would cost her dearly. Once inside, Adrian took in his surroundings. The antique furniture, the faded photographs on the walls, the smell of lavender and old wood. Rebecca offered him a seat and went to fetch her phone. As she turned her back, Adrian felt his pulse quicken. The moment he had fantasized about was here. His grip tightened on the camcorder as he followed her deeper into the house, his shadow stretching ominously behind him. Rebecca, oblivious to the danger, spoke kindly as she retrieved the phone, her voice a soft hum against the storm outside. Adrian's breathing grew heavier, his thoughts a chaotic storm of anticipation and dread. In that moment, the quiet, sleepy neighborhood of Willow Creek would never be the same again. Rebecca turned back with her phone in hand, her gentle smile illuminating her wrinkled face. She extended the phone toward Adrian, but before she could speak, a dull thud echoed through the room. Adrian had swung a heavy object, an antique brass candlestick he'd noticed on a nearby table. The impact was immediate, Rebecca's body crumpling to the ground with a soft gasp. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the relentless rain tapping against the windows. Adrian stood frozen, his chest rising and falling as he stared at Rebecca's still form. The enormity of what he'd just done began to seep into his mind, but it wasn't remorse he felt. It was a strange sense of accomplishment, mingled with an unsettling calm. He crouched beside her, his hands trembling as he placed the camcorder on a nearby table, its red light blinking steadily. Pressing the record button, Adrian's face filled the screen as he spoke in a hushed, almost reverent tone. "This is what it feels like," he murmured, glancing at the lifeless woman beside him. "Control. Power. The silence after the storm." Adrian spent the next 2 hours meticulously staging the scene, his movements mechanical and deliberate. He dragged Rebecca's body into the living room, arranging her in a way that seemed almost peaceful. He spoke to the camera intermittently, narrating his thoughts, his emotions, or lack thereof. "I thought I'd feel scared," he said, his voice eerily calm. "But it's not fear. It's clarity, like I've stepped out of a fog." He examined Rebecca's belongings, her photographs, her keepsakes. Each item seemed to tell a story of a life well lived, a life now ended. Adrian felt a strange sense of detachment as he thumbed through the memories of a stranger, recording every detail as if compiling evidence for a twisted personal archive. At one point, he sat beside Rebecca's body, his face inches from hers, studying her features with a clinical curiosity. The camcorder captured everything: the flicker of candlelight on her pale skin, the shadows dancing in the corners of the room, and Adrian's expression, a mixture of fascination and emptiness. The storm outside intensified, the howling wind and crashing thunder mirroring the chaos within the house. Adrian's monologue to the camcorder became more erratic, his words tumbling out in a torrent of fragmented thoughts. "Do you think she knew? In that last moment, did she understand what was happening?" He paused, staring into the lens. "Does it even matter?" As the hours wore on, Adrian's energy began to wane. He sat on the floor, the camcorder still rolling, his gaze fixed on Rebecca's body. The initial thrill had ebbed away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. For the first time, doubt began to creep in. "What now?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the storm. In his haste to leave, Adrian failed to notice that the camcorder, now filled with damning evidence, was still recording. He wiped his fingerprints from the surfaces he'd touched, but left the device sitting on the coffee table, its red light blinking steadily. He slipped out the back door, the rain washing away the bloodstains on his hands as he disappeared into the night. Behind him, the house stood silent, a grim monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Unbeknownst to Adrian, the storm had not only concealed his actions, but had also awakened the neighborhood. A neighbor, concerned by the strange noises and the sight of Rebecca's open door, decided to investigate. By morning, the crime scene would be discovered, and the hunt for the shadowy perpetrator would begin. For now, though, Adrian was free, his dark desires fulfilled. Yet, as he walked through the rain-soaked streets, the weight of his actions began to settle on his shoulders. The thrill he had sought, the power he had craved, it all felt hollow now, like a shadow dissolving with the first light of dawn. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a neighborhood still cloaked in eerie silence. The first rays of sunlight glinted off the puddles on Cedar Lane, but the tranquility was soon shattered by the piercing scream of Rebecca's neighbor. Mrs. Caldwell, a retiree who lived 2 houses down, had come to check on Rebecca after noticing her door ajar the night before. What she found instead was a scene that would haunt her forever. Within minutes, the street was alive with flashing red and blue lights. Police cars, crime scene vans, and curious onlookers filled the quiet cul-de-sac. Officers secured the perimeter as detectives entered Rebecca's home. The scene inside was both meticulous and grotesque. Rebecca's body, arranged as if in a macabre display, lay in the center of the living room. On the coffee table, a camcorder sat silently, its lens pointed toward the horrific tableau. Detective Sarah Monroe, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, was the first to approach the camcorder. She pressed play, her face hardening as the footage revealed Adrian's chilling monologue and his methodical actions. The young boy's face was unmistakable, his voice calm yet unnervingly detached. "Get a tech team in here," Monroe instructed, her tone brisk but laced with tension. "We've got a lot to unpack." Meanwhile, news of Rebecca's murder spread like wildfire. The media descended on Willow Creek, reporters crowding the streets and broadcasting live from the once peaceful neighborhood. Headlines screamed of a heinous act, and speculation ran rampant. Who could commit such a crime, and why? Adrian, oblivious to the chaos he had unleashed, went about his day as if nothing had happened. He returned home, cleaned himself thoroughly, and deleted incriminating files from his devices. He was confident in his planning, certain that no one would trace the crime back to him. What he didn't realize was that the camcorder he had so carelessly left behind had captured not only his face, but every chilling detail of his actions. Detective Monroe and her team quickly pieced together the evidence. The camcorder, paired with Adrian's distinct appearance and voice, left little doubt about his identity. Surveillance footage from nearby houses provided additional clues, showing Adrian entering Rebecca's home the previous night. By afternoon, an arrest warrant was issued. Adrian was at school when the police arrived. The sight of officers in uniform caused a stir among students and teachers, but Adrian maintained his composure. It wasn't until Monroe approached him, her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights, that his calm facade cracked. "Adrian Walker," Monroe said firmly, "you're under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Hargrove." The hall fell silent as Adrian was handcuffed and escorted out. Whispers rippled through the crowd, disbelief etched on every face. Adrian's parents, notified of the arrest, rushed to the station, their faces pale with shock and confusion. At the police station, Adrian sat in the interrogation room, his expression a mixture of defiance and unease. Monroe entered, placing the camcorder on the table between them. "You left this behind," she said, her voice steady. "Care to explain?" Adrian's eyes flicked to the camcorder, his mask of indifference faltering. For the first time, the gravity of his actions seemed to register. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had to. I needed to know." Monroe frowned, her pen pausing over her notepad. "Know what, Adrian? What could justify taking an innocent life?" Adrian didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. Monroe leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Whatever you think you've achieved, it's over now," she said. "The evidence is all here, Adrian. You documented everything." As Adrian sat in silence, the reality of his situation closed in. The police had not only uncovered his crime, but also his obsession, his online searches, and the forums he frequented. The picture they painted was one of a deeply disturbed young man, consumed by darkness and disconnected from reality. By evening, Adrian had been formally charged with Rebecca's murder. His parents, devastated and bewildered, struggled to reconcile the boy they knew with the monster described in the police reports. The media, hungry for details, painted Adrian as a cold-blooded killer, while experts debated the role of mental health, the internet, and the failure of society to recognize warning signs. For Adrian, the weight of his actions grew heavier with each passing hour. Alone in his cell, he replayed the events of that night in his mind, the thrill that had once consumed him, now replaced by a suffocating emptiness. He had sought control, power, and understanding, but all he had found was destruction, of a life, of a community, and of his own future. Adrian's trial began 6 months after his arrest, and by then, his name had become synonymous with horror. The media dubbed him the Willow Creek Killer, and the case attracted nationwide attention. Courtroom sketches of the boy with piercing eyes and an impassive demeanor circulated across newspapers and television screens. The prosecution's case was airtight, built around the camcorder's damning footage and forensic evidence. Adrian's recorded monologues offered a chilling glimpse into his psyche, while experts testified about his fascination with death and his premeditated actions. Adrian's defense team, led by a public defender, focused on his age and mental health. Psychiatrists described his isolation, his obsession with violent content, and his detachment from reality. They argued that Adrian wasn't a monster, but a troubled teenager who had slipped through the cracks of a failing system. Rebecca's family, seated stoically in the courtroom, listened as their beloved matriarch's final moments were dissected. Her eldest granddaughter, Emily, took the stand to describe Rebecca's kindness, her love for her family, and the deep void her loss had left. She was 98 years old, Emily said, her voice breaking. She had lived through wars, loss, and hardship, and she deserved to die peacefully, not at the hands of a child with no regard for human life. Adrian remained silent throughout the trial, his expression unreadable. When asked if he wanted to address the court, he declined, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The jury deliberated for less than a day before delivering their verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge, citing the brutality of the crime and Adrian's lack of remorse, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Adrian was led out of the courtroom in shackles, his parents watching helplessly from the gallery. His mother sobbed quietly, while his father stared ahead, his face a mask of grief and disbelief. As Adrian passed Rebecca's family, Emily leaned forward, her voice barely audible, but filled with steel. "You took her from us," she said, "but you'll never take her spirit. She was stronger than you'll ever be." Adrian didn't respond. Inside his cell that night, Adrian sat on the cold metal bed, staring at the walls that would confine him for the rest of his life. The thrill he had sought, the power he had imagined, had dissolved into an endless void of regret and despair. Rebecca's home was eventually sold, but no family ever stayed for long. Neighbors avoided Cedar Lane, unwilling to walk past the house that had become a symbol of the unthinkable. For the residents of Willow Creek, the tragedy was a harsh reminder of the darkness that could exist even in the most idyllic of places. And for Adrian, it was a lifetime of solitude, to reflect on the moment he chose to cross the line from fascination to atrocity, leaving behind a legacy of pain and unanswered questions. As the years passed, Rebecca's memory lived on in the hearts of those who loved her. Her family, determined to honor her legacy, created a foundation to support elderly individuals living alone, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. Adrian remained a shadow in the world, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of schools and the pages of crime novels. His name became a symbol of warning, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the devastating consequences of unchecked darkness. And so, the story ended where it had begun, in the quiet streets of Willow Creek, forever marked by the shadow of a deed that would never be forgotten.